The phone rang at 6:14 in the morning, and the woman on the other end said the words that split my life into before and after. "Mr. Ortiz, I'm calling from First Heritage Title. We have a signed closing package for 4417 Birch Street, and I need to confirm. Did your wife have authorization to sell this property?" I stood barefoot on the cold kitchen tile of my house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, coffee pot still gurgling behind me, and I said the only thing I could say. "No, she didn't. That house isn't even in her name." There was a pause on the line, papers shuffling. Then, "Sir, I think you need to sit down, because that sale already closed yesterday at 3 p.m., and the money's gone." My knees actually buckled. 22 years of marriage, and Renata had just tried to sell a house behind my back. Except she hadn't sold the house she thought she was selling. She'd sold the wrong one. And by the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly how a single mistyped address unraveled every secret she'd spent 3 years building and cost her everything she was trying to steal. If stories about quiet, devastating consequences hit different for you, stick around and subscribe, because this family isn't done falling apart yet. What happened next wasn't just a legal mess. It was the moment I found out who my wife really was. Stay until the end, because the twist in the deed records is something even I didn't see coming. My name is Daniel Ortiz. I'm 48 years old, and I've lived in Tulsa my whole life, same zip code my father grew up in. I run a small HVAC repair company, the kind where my number's still the one people call at midnight when their furnace dies in January. I met Renata when I was 26 at my cousin's engagement party, and I fell for her fast. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with 3 new friends. We built a life together. 2 kids, my daughter Mia, now 24, and my son Caleb, 21, away at college in Norman. When my father passed 6 years ago, he left me 2 properties, the house I grew up in on Elm Street, and a smaller rental house 2 blocks over on Birch Street, nearly identical in layout because the same builder put up half that neighborhood in 1978. I kept Elm Street as a rental. Birch Street, I quietly deeded over to Mia 3 years ago as a wedding gift, months before she even got engaged, because I wanted her to have something steady before the world got complicated. I never told Renata the deed had changed hands. Looking back, I think some part of me already sensed something was off. Renata had started taking calls in the garage, deleting texts a little too fast, mentioning investment opportunities from a real estate friend named Grant Pruitt. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong. The warning signs were already there. I just wasn't ready to read them yet. It started small, the way these things always do. About 8 months before that phone call, Renata began asking questions about Elm Street. What it was worth, whether I'd ever consider selling it, how the market was doing in that part of town. I didn't think much of it. We'd talked about downsizing rentals before. But then she started asking about paperwork. "Where do you keep the deed?" she asked one night, stirring pasta sauce like it was the most casual question in the world. "In the safe deposit box. Why?" "Just curious. Making sure we're organized." I believed her. That's the part that still stings. I believe her completely. A few weeks later, I noticed she'd started meeting a man named Grant Pruitt for coffee. She said he was helping her explore some investment ideas, a licensed realtor she'd known from her old job at the bank. I met him once, briefly, at a community fundraiser. He had the kind of handshake that lasted 2 seconds too long. Something about him made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Renata started going to networking lunches twice a week. She started dressing differently. She started locking her phone with a code she'd never used before. I told myself people change. People get new hobbies, new friends. I told myself a lot of things that spring. My mother used to say, the loudest silence in a marriage is the one right before something breaks. I didn't understand what she meant until Renata started sleeping with her laptop instead of leaving it in the kitchen. Mia noticed before I did. She came over for Sunday dinner in March and pulled me aside in the garage while Renata was inside plating food. "Dad, has Mom asked you anything weird about Birch Street?" My stomach dropped a little. "No. What?" Mia hesitated, the way she used to when she was a kid and didn't want to get someone in trouble. "She called me last month asking if I still technically live there or if I consider renting it out through someone she knows. I told her it was my house, and she got weird about it, said technically again, like the deed didn't matter. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You didn't tell her I gave it to you outright? I thought you had. I thought that's why she was asking. That night, lying in bed next to Renata, I studied the back of her head in the dark like I could read her thoughts through her hairline. I didn't say anything. I wanted more information first. I wanted to understand what I was actually dealing with before I confronted anyone. 2 weeks later, I found a manila folder in the garage, tucked behind old paint cans, labeled in Renata's handwriting, Birch ST Comps. Inside were printed listings of nearby homes, appraisal ranges, and a sticky note that read, Grant says fast close possible if title clean. My hands were shaking by the time I put it back exactly where I found it. I wasn't ready to blow up my marriage over a folder, but I started paying very, very close attention. I decided to test the water instead of confronting her outright. I wanted to see how far this would go before I stepped in. At dinner that Friday, I brought up Birch Street casually. You ever think about what happens to that house long term? Me is there, but it's still just sitting on our books. Renata's face did something I'd never seen before, a flicker, gone almost as fast as it appeared. I mean, it'd probably sell well, she said too smoothly. That whole street's appreciated a lot. Might be worth getting it appraised, just to know. Maybe, I said, and let it drop. But that night, I called my attorney, an old friend named Priya Shah, and asked her a question I never thought I'd need to ask about my own wife. If someone tried to sell a property they weren't on the deed for, using forged authorization, what actually happens? Priya went quiet for a second. Daniel, is this hypothetical, or should I be pulling out a notepad? I told her everything. The folder, the comps, Grant Pruitt, the technically comment to Mia. She told me 2 things I've never forgotten. First, that title companies are required to verify ownership before closing, so any fraud attempt would eventually hit a wall, unless someone on the inside was cutting corners. Second, that I needed to quietly confirm Mia's deed was airtight and recorded, because paperwork gaps are exactly what people like Grant Pruitt know how to exploit. I hung up that night with a plan forming and a marriage I no longer fully recognized. I called the county recorder's office the next morning before work. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel in the parking lot. The clerk pulled up the file in under a minute. 4417 Birch Street, she read out. Recorded deed transferred from Daniel R. Ortiz to Mia C. Ortiz. 3 years ago, quitclaim, properly notarized and filed. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. Whatever Renata was planning, the house wasn't hers to sell. Not legally, not on paper, not in any world where the system worked the way it was supposed to. But I also knew Renata. She didn't chase dead ends. If she was still meeting Grant Pruitt, still keeping folders of comps, still asking Mia loaded questions about technically owning her house, she had a plan to get around that wall Priya warned me about. I started watching more carefully. I noticed Renata had started referring to the Elm Street sale in phone calls I wasn't meant to overhear, always with the bathroom door shut, the shower running as cover. Elm Street was still legally mine and mine alone, a rental fully in my name, no complications. If she was talking about selling Elm Street without me, that was its own kind of betrayal, but at least it wasn't fraud against our daughter. I told myself that was almost a relief. I was wrong about which house she actually meant, and I wouldn't understand how wrong until the morning that phone rang and a title company employee asked me a question that didn't make sense yet. At this point, I want you to understand something about me. I'm not a confrontational man by nature. I fix furnaces. I coach Caleb's old rec league baseball team from the sidelines during summers he's home. My instinct has always been to gather facts quietly before I ever raise my voice. So instead of confronting Renata, I started documenting. I photographed the folder in the garage before returning it exactly where I found it. I kept a log of dates when she mentioned Grant Pruitt, or the sale, or referenced needing clean title, a phrase that meant nothing to me before and everything to me now. Priya told me something else that stuck with me. People who commit this kind of fraud almost never do it alone the first time. There's usually a smaller trial run first, something they think won't get caught. I didn't know what that meant until I found a second folder, this one hidden inside a shoebox in the back of her closet, labeled Grant Elm Documents. Inside were photocopies of my driver's license, My signature traced on a blank paper 3 separate times in increasingly convincing versions, and a single sticky note. Practice Sig, get closer to his loop on the D. My own wife had been practicing forging my signature in our bedroom closet. I sat on the floor of that closet for almost 20 minutes, just staring at those pages, feeling something in my chest cave in slowly, like ice cracking under weight it was never built to hold. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a plan. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Renata, listening to her breathe evenly beside me, and I thought about every version of our marriage I thought I knew. I thought about our wedding at Riverside Chapel, about the year Caleb was born early and she slept in a hospital chair for 6 nights straight, about the woman who used to leave notes in my lunch cooler that just said proud of you for no reason at all. That woman felt very far away from the one with a shoebox full of forged signatures in her closet. The next morning, I called Priya again, and this time she was blunt. Daniel, you need to protect yourself before you confront her. Get copies of everything. Secure Mia's deed information formally with her, and consider whether you need to freeze any joint accounts. That last part hit hardest. Joint accounts. If Renata was planning to funnel proceeds from a fraudulent sale somewhere, our shared money was the most obvious place. I spent the next several days quietly moving pieces into place, not to punish her yet, just to make sure whatever she was building couldn't collapse on Mia, or Caleb, or me. I met Mia for coffee, and without alarming her too much, asked her to have her own attorney formally confirm her sole ownership and add a fraud alert to the property, a precaution just in case anyone ever tried anything. She looked at me for a long moment. Dad, is this about Mom? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Some questions your children ask, you can see they already know the answer. Grant Pruitt, it turned out, wasn't just a realtor Renata knew from her old bank job. Priya's paralegal did some digging and found his name attached to 2 prior real estate disputes, one involving a client's elderly mother whose home was nearly sold without her full understanding of the paperwork, settled quietly out of court. He had a pattern. He found people with a weak point, confusion, distance, distraction, or, in Renata's case, apparently a husband who traveled for HVAC supplier conferences twice a year and trusted his wife with the household paperwork. I confronted none of this with Renata directly. Not yet. Instead, I did something that changed everything without her knowing it. I called First Heritage Title myself, the company whose stamp I'd seen on old paperwork in our files, and I asked to speak to a supervisor. I explained, carefully and calmly, that I had reason to believe someone might attempt a fraudulent sale involving my properties, and I wanted both Elm Street and Birch Street flagged for enhanced verification, meaning any closing attempt would require me, personally, in person, with government ID, no exceptions. The supervisor, a woman named Denise Calhoun, took detailed notes and assured me the flags would go into the system that afternoon. I hung up feeling like I'd finally done something instead of just watching. What I didn't know yet was that Renata and Grant had already scheduled a closing for a property they believed was Elm Street. The problem was the address on their paperwork was wrong. Here's the thing about Elm Street and Birch Street that made this whole disaster possible. The houses look almost identical. Same builder, same floor plan, same brick facade, same slope of the driveway. The only real difference is the street sign and a 2-block distance. Renata had apparently pulled comps and photos for both addresses at some point, mixing files as she built her case for our sale, and somewhere in that process, in a rush to move fast before I could interfere, Grant's assistant pulled the wrong file when preparing the closing package. Instead of listing 2209 Elm Street, the paperwork that went to First Heritage Title read 4417 Birch Street. Mia's house, the one with the fraud flag already sitting active in the system from my call 3 days earlier. Renata, in a hurry, in a hotel conference room an hour from home, signed forged documents for a house she had no legal claim to whatsoever, using my trace signature, believing she was closing on Elm Street. She had no idea. Grant, apparently, didn't catch it either, too busy pushing the deal through before anyone could ask questions. The system flagged it instantly, but by some administrative gap, the closing itself still processed before the flag review caught up, enough for funds to briefly move before everything froze. And that's the moment my phone rang at 6:14 in the morning, and a stranger's voice asked me a question that would end my marriage as I knew it, and begin the unraveling of everything Renata had spent months trying to build behind my back. I hung up with the title company and called Priya before I even put on real clothes. It happened, I said. She sold Birch Street, Mia's house. Priya's voice sharpened instantly. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Don't call Renata yet. Don't call Mia yet either. Not until I know exactly what we're dealing with. Get to my office in an hour. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself drive, staring at the house Renata was still asleep inside, completely unaware that her plan had already detonated in a way she hadn't intended. When I got to Priya's office, she had Denise Calhoun from First Heritage Title on speakerphone within 20 minutes. Denise explained it plainly. The closing processed under enhanced verification protocols, but because the wire request came through before the fraud flag fully synced across our system, a partial disbursement went out, $61,400, before the block engaged and froze the remaining funds and the deed transfer itself. My mind was doing frantic math. $61,000 had moved somewhere. Where did it go? I asked. Denise hesitated. To an account under a Renata Ortiz, at a bank we don't usually see in these deals. Routing number traces to Arkansas. Renata didn't even have an account in Arkansas that I knew of, which meant either she'd opened one without me knowing, or Grant Pruitt had directed the funds somewhere convenient for himself, using her name as the front. I didn't know which possibility scared me more. I drove home with my hands so tight on the wheel my knuckles ached. Renata was in the kitchen when I walked in, wearing my old college sweatshirt, pouring coffee like it was any other Tuesday. You're back early, she said, not even turning around. Everything okay? I stood in the doorway and said the only thing I had the strength to say. Birch Street sold yesterday. Mia's house. Renata's whole body went rigid. The coffee mug hovered halfway to the counter. That's not possible, she said too fast. That was supposed to be Elm Street. The second the words left her mouth, she knew. I watched the realization crash over her face in real time, the color draining, her hand gripping the counter edge like the floor had tilted beneath her. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God, Daniel, that's not what we. I said, there's a we now. She sat down hard on a kitchen chair, the mug forgotten, coffee cooling untouched. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then she started talking fast, desperate, the way people talk when the truth is the only thing left holding back a flood. I was going to sell Elm Street. Just Elm Street. I thought, Daniel, we needed the money. You don't even know how bad things got with the shop's line of credit last year. And Grant said it would be simple, quiet. Before you even had to know, you forged my signature, I said quietly. In our closet. I found the practice sheets. She stopped talking completely. The silence after that stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming, a neighbor's lawnmower 2 houses down, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning happening around the wreckage of my marriage. Finally, Renata said, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, How long have you known? Weeks, I said. The folder in the garage. The shoebox in your closet. Priya's been helping me protect Mia's deed since I found the practice signatures. Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly, but the specific exhaustion of someone who's been carrying a lie so long that finally being caught almost feels like putting down a weight. I never wanted to touch Mia's house, she said. I swear to you, Daniel, I never meant for that address to end up on the paperwork. Grant's assistant pulled the wrong file. I told them Elm Street. Over and over, I don't understand how that doesn't matter right now, I said, and I meant it. What matters is that $61,000 moved into an account in Arkansas under your name, and I need to know if you opened that account or if Grant did. Renata's face went from devastated to something closer to fear. Arkansas? I don't have any account in Arkansas. Daniel, I swear to you I don't. And for the first time since that phone call at 6:14 that morning, I realized this might be bigger and worse than even Renata understood. She hadn't just been committing fraud. She might have been being used by someone running a much larger scheme, with her signature as the bait. I called Priya back within the hour, and she brought in a forensic accountant she'd worked with before, a methodical woman named Sylvia Reyes who specialized in exactly this kind of financial unraveling. Sylvia pulled records on the Arkansas account within 2 days, and what she found made my stomach turn in a completely different direction than I expected. The account had been opened 4 months earlier, using Renata's name, her social security number, and a signature that was close to hers but, under magnification, subtly wrong in 3 places. "Someone opened this account posing as your wife," Sylvia said flatly, spreading printouts across Priya's conference table. "Real ID theft, not just fraud on her part. My guess, based on the pattern, is Grant Pruitt or someone working with him used information Renata gave him during their planning meetings to set this up as a landing spot for the funds, likely intending to move the money out again before she ever even saw a statement." Renata sat across the table, pale, hands wrapped around a coffee she hadn't touched in an hour. "He told me he was helping me set up a private account so you wouldn't see the sale on our joint statements," she said quietly. "I thought it was mine. I thought I was in control of it." Sylvia looked at her, not unkindly. "Mrs. Ortiz, based on what I'm seeing, you were never going to see a dollar of that money. You weren't the client here. You were the cover story." That sentence landed on Renata like a physical blow. I watched something in her collapse. Not just guilt now, but the specific horror of realizing you weren't the mastermind of your own betrayal, just a tool in someone else's. "I need to call him," she said suddenly, reaching for her phone. Priya's hand shot out and stopped her. "Absolutely not. If Grant Pruitt is running a fraud scheme, any contact from you right now could tip him off, let him move remaining funds, or worse, implicate you further if this goes to the district attorney." Renata's hands were shaking. "Am I going to be charged with a crime?" Priya's answer was careful, measured. "Possibly. Forging a signature and attempting to sell property you don't own is a serious offense regardless of what Grant Pruitt did on the back end. But cooperating now, documenting everything, showing you were also a victim of identity theft in the Arkansas account, that matters. That's the difference between a defendant and a witness who made a terrible mistake." I sat there watching my wife of 22 years absorb the reality that she might face actual criminal charges, and I felt something complicated churning in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but not pure fury either. I thought about the shop's line of credit she'd mentioned, the thing she said we needed the money for. I hadn't even known there was a problem. 22 years, and apparently we'd stopped telling each other the truth about money long before she ever met Grant Pruitt. I called Mia that night. I couldn't put it off any longer. She deserved to hear it from me before a stranger from a title company called her instead. She came over within the hour, Caleb joining by video call from his dorm in Norman, both of their faces doing the same thing when I explained it, shock sliding slowly into a kind of numb disbelief. "She tried to sell my house," Mia said, very quietly, staring at the kitchen table like it might rearrange itself into an answer that made sense. "Not on purpose," I said, and immediately hated how much that sounded like I was defending her. "She meant to sell Elm Street. The paperwork got mixed up. That doesn't make it okay, Dad." "I know," I said. "I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying it's more complicated than your mother tried to steal your house on purpose." Caleb's voice came through the laptop speaker, tight and controlled in a way that reminded me painfully of myself. "Did she go to jail?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Your mother forged documents. That's a real crime. But it looks like she was also being used by someone else, someone running a bigger scheme, using her as cover." Mia was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading most. "Did she ever love us, Dad? Or was she just, I don't know, always looking for an angle?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know if I do, even now, looking back at all of it. Renata wanted to talk to Mia directly, but Priya advised against it until the legal situation was clearer. Anything said in an emotional, uncontrolled conversation could complicate the eventual case, especially with the fraud investigation now moving forward. So for almost 2 weeks, Renata lived in a strange, suspended silence in our house, sleeping in the guest room, barely eating, jumping every time the phone rang. I watched her go from the confident, sharp woman I'm married to someone who flinched at doorbells. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied by that. Most of me just felt tired. Sylvia Reyes kept digging into Grant Pruitt's history and found something that widened the case considerably. He wasn't operating alone. There was a woman at a small regional title processing company, a notary named Carla Dunbar, who had stamped and approved documents on at least 4 suspicious property transactions over the past 2 years, always involving spouses acting without full authorization from co-owner. Renata wasn't his first target. She might not even have been his most successful one. Sylvia found records suggesting at least one prior sale had actually gone through cleanly, funds vanishing into accounts that were later closed and untraceable. Whatever mistake sent the Birch Street paperwork to the wrong address, whatever administrative error triggered my fraud flag at exactly the right moment, it wasn't just luck that stopped Renata. It was the only thing that had ever stopped Grant Pruitt at all. The Tulsa Police Financial Crimes Unit got involved formally once Sylvia's findings were presented to the district attorney's office. Detective Aaron Whitfield, a calm, unhurried man who'd clearly seen every version of family fraud there was, sat across from Renata and me in Priya's conference room and laid it out plainly. Mrs. Ortiz, based on what we're seeing, you're going to need to make a decision. You can cooperate fully, help us build the case against Pruitt and Dunbar, and your attorney can negotiate accordingly. Or you can stay quiet and hope this resolves itself, which, frankly, it won't. Renata didn't hesitate. I'll tell you everything, she said. Every meeting, every text, every promise he made me. And she did. Over the following weeks, she handed over records I didn't even know existed. Screenshots of texts from Grant promising clean, fast, no questions, voicemails where he'd coach her on what to say if I asked questions about the paperwork, even a recorded call where he'd explicitly told her not to mention the sale to the daughter until it was already finalized. Listening to that recording in Priya's office, I finally understood something I'd been struggling to accept. Renata hadn't planned to hurt Mia. She'd been manipulated into believing this was victimless, quiet, contained, a private financial fix that would never touch our children. She was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but for the first time since that 6:14 a.m. phone call, I could see the outline of how a person becomes capable of something like this without ever fully deciding to. Here's something I need you to sit with for a second, because it changed how I saw this whole nightmare. Renata's cooperation didn't just help the case against Grant Pruitt. It unraveled it completely. Within 3 weeks, detectives had enough evidence. Her records combined with Carla Dunbar's notary logs and 2 other victims Sylvia had identified independently to arrest Grant on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft across state lines, given the Arkansas account. Carla was arrested separately, her notary license suspended pending investigation. If you've ever wondered whether coming forward actually matters, whether telling the ugly truth actually changes anything, I watched it happen in real time. Renata's confession was the loose thread that pulled the whole scheme apart. But cooperation doesn't erase consequences. The district attorney's office still had to decide what to do about Renata's own forgery. My signature, traced in our closet, used on real closing documents. Priya negotiated hard, presenting Renata as a manipulated, financially desperate first-time offender who'd ultimately provided the evidence that broke a repeat fraud operation. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't nothing that she'd done either. If this story is making you think about someone in your own life who might be in over their head with a decision they can't undo alone, tell us about it in the comments below. Sometimes the people closest to us are drowning quietly, right where we can almost see it. The initial fallout didn't end with legal consequences. It rippled through everything. Mia stopped answering Renata's calls entirely for almost a month. The fraud flag on her house, now a permanent scar on a place that was supposed to represent a fresh start. Caleb came home from Norman for a long weekend, quieter than I'd ever seen him, spending most of it in the garage with me, pretending to help fix an old lawnmower neither of us cared about, both of us needing somewhere to put our hands while our heads sorted through the wreckage. My own brother, Marcus, found out through Mia and called me late one night, furious on my behalf, offering to handle Grant Pruitt personally in a way I had to talk him down from. And Renata moved through those weeks like someone walking through a house after a fire, touching the burned edges of everything, trying to figure out what could still be salvaged. The $61,000 that had briefly moved was eventually recovered by investigators, frozen before Grant could fully launder it, though the process would take months to formally return to Mia's deed and clear the fraud flag completely. We were technically financially whole again, but something else had burned down that no recovered wire transfer could rebuild. The version of my marriage where I trusted the person sleeping beside me without needing a fraud alert on my own children's houses. I didn't know yet if that version could come back. I only knew we weren't there yet. 3 weeks after Grant Pruitt's arrest, a subplot I hadn't seen coming started surfacing. One that had nothing to do with fraud and everything to do with a secret Renata had been carrying long before Grant Pruitt ever entered her life. It started with a name I didn't recognize on a bank statement Sylvia flagged during her forensic review, a recurring monthly transfer of $400, going out for nearly 2 years, to an account under the name T. Wickham. I asked Renata about it directly, expecting another layer of the fraud scheme. Instead, her face crumpled in an entirely different way. "That's not related to any of this," she said quietly. "That's my sister." "Esther de Hare. You don't have a sister." "I do," she said. "Half-sister. Tessa. Our father had another family before he married my mom. I found her 4 years ago through one of those DNA sites, and she was Daniel. She was in a bad way. Addiction, no support, a kid she couldn't take care of on her own some months. I've been helping her quietly ever since. 22 years of marriage, and there was an entire sister I'd never heard of, an entire relationship Renata had built and hidden in parallel to our life. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't a crime. But it was another secret, another version of Renata I didn't know existed, surfacing in the wreckage of the first one. "Is that why you needed money?" I asked. "Partly," she admitted. The shop's credit line was real too. But Tessa's part of why I panicked enough to listen to Grant in the first place. I didn't know what to do with this information at first. It complicated everything in a way I wasn't prepared for. Part of me was angry. Another secret, another wall I hadn't known existed in my own marriage. But another part of me, a quieter part, recognized something almost sympathetic in it. Renata hadn't hidden a sister because she was cruel. She'd hidden her because she was ashamed, scared of how it would look, scared maybe of what it said about her own family that this half-sister existed at all, the product of something her father had never told anyone about while he was alive. I asked to meet Tessa. Renata resisted at first, then relented, and 2 weeks later, I sat across a diner booth from a thin, nervous woman in her late 30s with Renata's exact same eyebrows and none of her polish. Tessa cried almost immediately. "I didn't know she was in trouble," she said. "She never told me anything about you, about the kids, about any of this. She just kept sending money and saying everything was fine." It became clear, sitting there, that Renata had built an entire second life of quiet obligation, supporting a sister she was embarrassed to acknowledge, using money she didn't have, while telling neither of us the full truth about the other. It wasn't the betrayal I thought I was dealing with. It was a different one, older and sadder, running underneath the fraud case like a second current I hadn't noticed until the first one nearly drowned us both. Mia found out about Tessa before I was ready to tell her, because Caleb, in a rare moment of impulsiveness, mentioned it during a family group text without thinking through the timing. The reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of more anger, Mia seemed almost deflated by it, like this new information had rearranged the entire shape of her fury into something more like grief. "So this whole time," she said to me on the phone, "Mom had a whole secret family thing going on, and she still tried to sell my house to cover a lie she was too scared to just tell us about?" "It's not that simple," I said, surprising myself by defending Renata again. "She was drowning Mia. Badly. She just drowned in a direction that hurt you. That doesn't make it hurt less." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm asking you to understand that the woman who did this isn't a cartoon villain. She's just someone who made catastrophic decisions, trying to hold up more weight than she should have carried alone." There was a long silence on the line. "Why didn't she just tell us, Dad? Any of us could have helped." It was the same question I kept asking myself, turning it over every night in the guest room where I'd started sleeping too, needing space to think. Why hide a sister? Why hide debt? Why hide anything when hiding had cost her almost everything she was trying to protect in the first place? I started seeing a therapist, something I'd never done in my life, a quiet, steady woman named Dr. Okafor who specialized in betrayal trauma. In our third session, she said something that stuck with me for the rest of this ordeal. Discovering a secret like the fraud is often the beginning, not the end, of understanding someone. People rarely lie about just one thing. The lie you found is usually sitting on top of other lies, and sometimes, underneath all of it, there's something almost understandable. Not forgivable necessarily, but understandable. I thought about that constantly as more pieces came out. Renata had been carrying Tessa's secret for 4 years. She'd been quietly worried about the shop's finances for over a year, watching a line of credit balloon that she'd never mentioned to me because she admitted she didn't want me to think less of her business instincts, the one she'd been so proud of when she helped me expand into commercial HVAC contracts 5 years earlier. Every secret connected to another secret, a chain of things she decided, one at a time, that I couldn't handle or wouldn't understand or would judge her for. I started to understand that Renata's fraud wasn't really about greed. It was about a woman who'd spent years quietly convincing herself she had to solve every problem alone, even the ones that were tearing her apart, even when the person sleeping 6 inches away might have actually helped her carry it, if she'd only asked. The criminal case against Renata moved forward during all of this, running parallel to the family reckoning happening at home. Priya negotiated an agreement with the district attorney's office. Given Renata's full cooperation, the evidence she provided against Grant Pruitt and Carla Dunbar, and the fact that no permanent harm had ultimately reached Mia's property, the DA agreed to a deferred prosecution arrangement, probation, restitution, mandatory financial counseling, and a formal record that would be sealed if she completed every condition without incident over 18 months. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't prison, which is what it could have been. Renata cried when Priya told her, not from relief exactly, but from the specific exhaustion of finally facing a consequence that fit the size of what she'd actually done, instead of the catastrophe she'd been imagining every night since that 6:14 a.m. phone call. Mia attended the hearing where the agreement was finalized, sitting 3 rows back, arms crossed, saying nothing to her mother before or after. It was the first time she'd been in the same room with Renata since the day the fraud came to light. Small progress, I told myself, watching them exist in the same space without either one exploding. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just proximity, tolerated for now. Sometimes that's the only version of progress a family gets to have in the early months after something like this. Just people staying in the room instead of leaving it. Grant Pruitt's case revealed something during discovery that reframed everything about how this had started, and it's the detail that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it. Detective Whitfield told us, during a follow-up meeting, that Grant hadn't approached Renata randomly at that community fundraiser where I'd first met him with his too long handshake. He'd targeted her specifically after finding her old employment records from the bank where she used to work, records that mentioned a family financial hardship, note from years earlier, a small detail buried in an old HR file that Grant had somehow accessed through a contact still working there. He'd built a profile on her before he ever said hello. He knew about financial pressure before she'd told him a single thing. The networking lunches, the friendly coffee meetings, the gradual trust building over months. None of it had been organic. It had been a calculated approach on a person he'd already identified as vulnerable, using information she never knew he had. Learning that didn't excuse what Renata did, but it recontextualized it in a way that made my anger, for the first time since this began, point somewhere other than at her. Grant Pruitt hadn't stumbled onto an opportunistic housewife looking for an easy score. He'd hunted a specific woman he'd profiled as susceptible, and Renata had walked into a trap that had been built, patiently, months before she ever knew it existed. I brought this new information to Mia myself, sitting on her porch on Birch Street, the house that had nearly cost her everything, now sitting quiet in the evening light with the fraud flag finally beginning its slow legal removal from the county records. I'm not telling you this so you forgive her, I said carefully. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the whole picture, not just the part where she scared you. Mia was quiet for a long time, picking at a loose thread on the porch cushion. I keep thinking about how close it came, she finally said. Like, if that assistant hadn't grabbed the wrong file, if your fraud flag call had been a day later, I could have lost this house and never even known why until it was already gone. I know, I said. I think about that too. Do you forgive her, Dad? I didn't have a clean answer. I understand her more than I did a month ago, I said. I don't know yet if understanding turns into forgiveness. I think that a longer road than either of us wants it to be. Mia nodded slowly, looking out at the street where her house sat. Safe now, protected now, a symbol of both what almost went wrong and what had ultimately held. I want to understand her too, she said quietly. I'm just not ready yet to be in the same room as just Mom again. Only Mom who has to earn it back. I thought that was fair. I still do. Caleb processed all of this differently than his sister, the way he always has, quieter, more internal, working through things on his own timeline instead of out loud. He came home again for what would have been Renata's birthday, a date none of us mentioned out loud all day, and found me in the garage late that night, unable to sleep, sanding down an old dresser that didn't need sanding. Can I ask you something? He said, settling onto an overturned bucket beside my workbench. Are you going to stay married to her? It was the question everyone had been circling without asking directly for almost 2 months. I don't know, I said honestly. Some days I think yes. Some days I think there's no version of trust that survives finding forged signatures in your wife's closet. What tips it one way or the other? I set down the sandpaper, watching her with Dr. Okafor, watching her with the investigators, watching her actually change instead of just apologizing. Words are easy, Caleb. I've had 22 years of good words from your mother. What I need now is a long stretch of good actions before words mean anything again. Caleb nodded slowly, staring at the dresser like it held answers neither of us actually had. For what it's worth, he said eventually, I don't think she's a bad person. I think she's someone who got really good at solving problems by herself and forgot that was supposed to change once she had a family to lean on. Out of the mouths of 21-year-olds, sometimes comes exactly the truth you needed to hear. Renata began attending a support group for financial infidelity and family fraud recovery, something Dr. Okafor recommended, meeting twice a week in a community center basement with people who'd made similarly catastrophic decisions under similarly crushing pressure. She came home from those meetings different than she went in, quieter, less defensive, slowly building a vocabulary for what she'd done that didn't slide into either self-pity or excuse-making. One night, about 10 weeks after everything started, she knocked on the guest room door where I'd been sleeping and asked if she could talk. I'm not asking you to let me back into our bed, she said, standing in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. I know I haven't earned that. I just want to tell you something my group leader said tonight that I think you need to hear directly from me, not secondhand. I waited. She said the hardest part of recovery isn't confessing what you did. It's confessing why you thought you had to do it alone. And Daniel, I did think that. For years, honestly, way before Grant Pruitt ever existed. I decided somewhere along the way that showing you a problem meant admitting I'd failed at something, and I would rather commit an actual crime than let you see me fail. It was the most honest thing she'd said since that first horrible morning. I didn't hug her. I didn't forgive her out loud. But I told her thank you for saying it, and for the first time in 10 weeks, I meant it without reservation. The subplot with Tessa resolved in its own quiet way during this stretch, too. I insisted, once things had settled somewhat, that we bring her fully into the open, not as a secret shame, but as an actual member of an actual family, however complicated her arrival into it had been. Mia, surprising everyone, was the one who reached out to her first, meeting Tessa for coffee without telling anyone in advance, coming home afterward with red eyes and a strange, cautious softness in her voice. She's not what I expected, Mia told me. She's scared of all of us. She thinks we're going to hate her for existing, like she's some kind of walking scandal instead of just a person who got dealt a bad hand. We started, slowly, folding Tessa into holidays, into group texts, into the ordinary fabric of family life she'd never been offered before. It didn't fix the fraud case. It didn't undo the forged signatures or the $61,000 that had briefly vanished into an account in Arkansas. But it meant something had grown out of the wreckage that hadn't existed before, an honest relationship built out in the open instead of another secret funneled through shame and quiet monthly transfers. Grant Pruitt's trial date was finally set for the following spring. Carla Dunbar had already pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Everything was converging toward a reckoning none of us could avoid much longer, and the twist that was still coming would change how I understood this entire story from the very beginning. The twist came from a place none of us expected. Sylvia Reyes, still combing through old financial records months after the initial fraud case had been resolved, found something buried in an account audit trail that made her call Priya directly instead of waiting for our next scheduled meeting. "I need you and the Ortizes in my office tomorrow morning," she said. "There's something in the Arkansas account history that doesn't add up, and I think it changes the timeline of everything." We sat around Priya's conference table the next day, and Sylvia laid out a spreadsheet of dates that made my stomach drop before she even finished explaining. "The Arkansas account wasn't opened 4 months before the Birch Street closing," she said. "It was opened 2 years before, and there were 3 prior small transfers into it, going back that far, each one under $5,000, each one time suspiciously close to a specific date." She looked up at Renata. "Mrs. Ortiz, do you recognize the date March 14th, 2 years ago?" Renata went white. That's the day I first met Grant. At the fundraiser." "Right," Sylvia said. "Which means this account, opened in your name, existed before you ever knowingly agreed to anything with him. Someone set this trap in motion the very day he introduced himself to you, which tells me the wrong address mistake on Birch Street wasn't a mistake at all. I think it was designed to fail in exactly the way it did." The room went completely silent. "Designed to fail how?" I finally asked. Sylvia pulled up another document. Grant Pruitt's pattern, across the other victims I identified, wasn't actually about successfully completing fraudulent sales. 2 of the 3 prior cases I found also involved administrative errors that triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny that stopped the sale partway through, after a partial disbursement had already gone out. I think Grant's real scheme wasn't stealing entire houses. It was engineering situations where a small amount of money moved fast into an account he controlled through identity theft before anyone could stop it completely. And then he'd walk away from the failed attempted sale before it ever became a fully prosecutable fraud, because the paper trail made it look like a confused spouse acting alone, not an organized theft. He never needed to actually sell me his house, or Elm Street, or anyone's house. He needed a closing to process just far enough to move $50,000 or $60,000 into an account before the world caught up. The wrong address wasn't Grant's assistant's mistake. Sylvia believed, based on internal metadata on the closing documents, that the address had been deliberately altered after Renata submitted the correct paperwork for Elm Street, swapped by someone inside the process itself, ensuring the deal would trip an automatic verification flag just late enough to still release a partial wire transfer. "Someone made sure this would blow up," Sylvia said. "Just not until after the money moved." "Who?" Renata asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who would have had access to swap that address after I submitted it?" Sylvia's answer landed like a second phone call at 6:14 in the morning. "Carla Dunbar, the notary. She's the one who processed the intake paperwork before it went to First Heritage Title. Her fingerprints, figuratively, are all over the metadata changes." Carla, who had already pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Grant, suddenly looked less like a secondary player and more like a co-architect of a scheme specifically engineered to look like a spouse's confused, unauthorized mistake rather than an organized theft ring. Detective Whitfield, when we brought this to him, confirmed that this changed the entire framing of the case against Renata. "If the address swap was deliberate and done without your wife's knowledge or consent," he told her directly, "you're not just a manipulated participant who happened to make catastrophic choices. You're a targeted identity theft victim who was set up to take the fall for a scheme other people built specifically to survive scrutiny by using you as the visible, prosecutable face of the fraud." Renata put her face in her hands and didn't move for a long time. I sat beside her, and for the first time since that first terrible morning, I reached over and put my hand on her back, not because everything was forgiven, but because I finally understood with total clarity how much of this had never actually been her decision to make alone. Priya moved fast once this new evidence surfaced, filing an emergency motion to reopen the terms of Renata's deferred prosecution agreement in light of what amounted to new exculpatory evidence. The DA's office, to their credit, took it seriously. Detective Whitfield's follow-up investigation into the metadata trail confirmed Sylvia's findings within 2 weeks, and Carla Dunbar, facing an additional charge for evidence tampering and orchestrating the address swap, agreed to a fuller confession in exchange for a plea deal that avoided trial entirely. In her confession, Carla admitted that she and Grant had specifically chosen Renata after learning, through the old bank HR file, about both her financial anxiety and her general unfamiliarity with real estate closing procedures, someone anxious enough to move fast and quiet, unfamiliar enough not to catch small irregularities in paperwork most people never read closely. They hadn't cared whether the sale succeeded. They'd cared whether the partial wire transfer succeeded and whether the fallout would land entirely on Renata's shoulders instead of theirs. It very nearly had, if I hadn't found that shoebox. If I hadn't called First Heritage Title, if the fraud flag hadn't synced in that narrow window before the wire fully processed, Renata could have been looking at real prison time for a scheme 2 strangers had built specifically to be pinned on her, while they walked away with $61,000 and moved on to their next target. The twist wasn't just what happened. It was how close it came to working exactly as they planned. With Carla's full confession entered into the case file, Priya negotiated Renata's charges down to a single count related to the forged signature itself, a real consequence for a real choice Renata had genuinely made on her own, separate from the larger scheme built around her. The DA agreed to reduce the deferred prosecution period from 18 months to 9, given the mitigating circumstances, and formally acknowledged in writing that Renata had been the target of a coordinated identity theft operation that exploited her existing vulnerability rather than the sole architect of the Birch Street fraud attempt. It wasn't a clean exoneration. Renata had still forged my signature. She had still lied to me for months, still hidden a sister, still let financial panic push her into a decision that could have devastated our daughter permanently. Those things remained true regardless of what Grant and Carla had built around her. But the shape of her guilt had changed, and so, gradually, had the shape of my anger. I sat Mia and Caleb down together and walked them through everything Sylvia and Detective Whitfield had uncovered. Mia listened with her arms crossed the way she always did now, but I watched something in her posture loosen slightly as the picture became clearer. So, she was being used, Mia said slowly. At the same time, she was actually doing something wrong. Both things are true. Both things are true, I agreed. That's usually how the real ones go. Nobody's ever just the villain of their own story, even when they've done something that hurt you badly. Grant Pruitt's trial happened faster than expected once Carla's confession gave the prosecution everything they needed to move without a lengthy discovery battle. He pleaded guilty on the second day, facing overwhelming evidence, and accepted a sentence of 11 years for fraud, forgery, and identity theft across state lines, with restitution ordered to all 4 known victims, including full reimbursement for Renata's legal fees related to the case. Sitting in that courtroom, watching a man who had built a business out of profiling vulnerable people finally run out of paperwork tricks to hide behind, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly, but a kind of quiet closure. This man had scanned an old HR file for a note about family financial hardship and decided that note made my wife a target instead of a person. He'd spent months coaching her toward a decision he'd already engineered her into making, then built the paperwork to make sure she alone would answer for it. Watching him sentenced, I finally understood the difference between what Renata had done and what had been done to her, 2 separate truths that had gotten tangled together in my mind since that first phone call, now finally pulling apart into something I could actually hold and examine honestly. She had made choices, bad ones, Choices that hurt Mia, that hurt our marriage, that hurt me. But she had also been hunted specifically and deliberately by two people who saw her anxiety as an opportunity instead of a person deserving basic decency. Both things were true. It was time to figure out what came next, knowing that. The turning point in our marriage didn't arrive as one dramatic scene. It arrived slowly, in small moments over the following weeks, the way real repair usually does. I moved back into our bedroom, not with fanfare, just quietly one Tuesday night, setting my pillow back on the side I'd slept on for 22 years. Renata didn't say anything about it. She just reached over in the dark and held my hand, and we lay there for a long time without talking, which somehow felt like more honest communication than either of us had managed in months. "I want to tell you something," she said eventually. "I've been going to that support group twice a week for 4 months now, and last week, my group leader asked us to name the exact moment we decided secrecy was safer than honesty. I know my answer now. It was the year Caleb was in that car accident, when he was 16. I remembered that year clearly. The terror of that hospital call, the months of physical therapy, the medical bills that had stretched us thin in ways we'd never fully discussed since. I decided that year," Renata continued, "that my job was to absorb pressure so you wouldn't have to. That if I just handled things quietly enough, you'd never have to feel as scared as I felt in that hospital hallway. I didn't realize I was building a habit that would eventually make me vulnerable to someone like Grant. I thought I was protecting you. I was actually just isolating myself." It was the clearest explanation she'd given me yet, and the first time I truly believed she understood her own pattern. I told Dr. Okafor about that conversation in my next session, and she asked me a question that reframed things further. "Daniel, in 22 years, how many times did Renata come to you with a problem she couldn't solve alone before all of this happened?" I sat with that for a long moment, genuinely trying to remember. "Almost never," I admitted. "She always came to me with problems already solved or close to solved. I used to think that was just who she was. Capable, independent." "And how did you respond in the moments she did show vulnerability?" I thought about the few times over the years. A bad performance review early in her banking career, a miscarriage before Caleb was born that she'd barely let me witness before pulling herself together and insisting she was fine. I let her. I'd respected what looked like strength without ever questioning whether it was actually armor. "I think I made it easy for her to hide," I said slowly. "Not on purpose. But I never pushed past 'I'm fine.' I took it at face value every time, because it was easier than sitting in her pain with her." Dr. Okafor nodded. "That's not the same as causing what she did. She made her own choices, and they were serious ones. But relationships are built by two people, and habits of hiding are usually reinforced from both directions, even unintentionally. Understanding that doesn't excuse her. It just gives you both something real to actually repair, instead of just punishing and hoping the pattern doesn't repeat itself." Mia agreed to have dinner with Renata alone for the first time, for months after everything began, at a small Italian place downtown neither of them had history with. Neutral ground, Mia had specifically requested. She told me about it afterward, sitting on my back porch with a glass of wine she barely touched. "She apologized properly," Mia said. "Not the kind of apology that's really an excuse wearing an apology's clothes." She said, word for word, "I let fear convince me your house was an acceptable risk, and there is no version of my reasons that makes that okay, and I am not going to ask you to move past it faster than you're ready to." I felt something loosen in my chest hearing that. "How'd you respond?" I told her I believed she didn't mean to target my house specifically. I told her that helped. But I also told her I needed her to understand that didn't mean to doesn't erase what it felt like, finding out from a stranger's phone call that I could have lost my home. Mia paused, turning her wine glass slowly. She just nodded and said, "You're right. I'm not asking you to unfeel that. I'm asking for the chance to become someone who never makes you feel that way again." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even close. Not yet. But it was the first real conversation between them since the fraud, built on honesty instead of defensiveness, and, after everything, that felt like genuine, hard-won progress. Caleb's turning point looked different from his sister's, quieter, more private, the way most things did with him. He asked Renata to help him with something specific. Reviewing his own student loan paperwork and a small credit card he'd opened at school, admitting he'd let some balances creep up without fully understanding the terms. It wasn't random. I think he chose that request deliberately, giving Renata a chance to be useful to him with money and paperwork in a small, controlled, low-stakes way. The exact terrain where everything had gone wrong, but this time with nothing to hide and nothing at risk. She spent an entire Saturday afternoon with him at the kitchen table, walking through interest rates and minimum payments, patient and thorough in a way that reminded me of the woman who used to help me build out pricing spreadsheets for the HVAC business in our first years of marriage. Afterward, Caleb found me in the garage. That felt weirdly important, he said. Like she needed to prove to herself she could be trusted with something financial again, even something small. How do you feel about her now? I asked. He considered honestly, the way he considers everything. I don't think I'm ready to say I forgive her completely, but I don't think I hate her anymore either. I think I just see her as someone who broke something badly and is doing the actual work to fix it, instead of just wanting credit for feeling bad about it. Out of everyone, I think Caleb found the clearest way to say what we were all feeling. Tessa became an unexpected anchor during this stretch of repair. She started coming to occasional Sunday dinners, tentative at first, watching the family dynamics like she was still waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong there. One evening, after dinner, she pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else cleared the table. "I need you to know something," she said. Renata used to call me, back when all this with Grant was happening, and just cry, not asking me for anything, not explaining details, just scared and ashamed, and not knowing how to stop what she'd already started. I think she knew it was wrong the whole time. I don't think she ever felt good about it, even for a second. Why didn't she just stop then? I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. Tessa shrugged, a gesture so much like Renata's it startled me. Because by the time she felt that scared, Grant had already convinced her stopping meant admitting failure to you, to the kids, to herself. Sometimes people don't stop a bad decision because they don't know it's still bad. They stop when the shame of continuing finally outweighs the shame of confessing. I think your phone call did that for her, honestly. I think some small part of her needed to get caught. I didn't know what to do with that theory, whether it was true or just a sister's generous interpretation. But it stayed with me, another piece of a person I was still, for months later, learning to fully understand. By the 5th month, Renata completed the first major milestone of her deferred prosecution agreement, a full financial audit demonstrating complete transparency, every account, every debt, every dollar accounted for and disclosed, no more shoeboxes, no more locked phones, no more separate accounts in Arkansas or anywhere else. She sat across from me at our kitchen table and slid a folder across to me, thick with every financial document from our entire marriage. "I want you to have full access to everything forever," she said. "Not because a judge is making me, because I understand now that privacy and secrecy aren't the same thing, and I confused them for years without even realizing it." I opened the folder and looked through it, not because I doubted her anymore, but because I think we both needed the ritual of it, the physical act of transparency replacing the physical act of hiding that had defined the worst year of our marriage. "I have something too," I said, and told her something I'd been sitting on for weeks. "I talked to Priya about formally adding you back on Elm Street's deed as a joint owner once your probation period concludes. Not as a reward, as a statement that I still believe in a version of us that shares things honestly instead of one of us carrying everything alone." Renata cried for a long time at that, the kind of crying that comes from relief instead of fear. And for the first time since that phone call at 6:14 in the morning, I felt like our marriage had a genuine future instead of just a slow, careful unwinding. The 9-month deferred prosecution period passed with Renata meeting every single condition without incident. Financial counseling completed, restitution fully paid, weekly support group attendance logged and verified, and a final psychological evaluation that Dr. Okafor herself contributed to, confirming genuine, sustained behavioral change rather than performative compliance. The day the DA's office formally sealed her record, Priya called with the news, and Renata sat down hard on our porch steps and put her face in her hands, Not crying this time, just breathing like someone finally allowed to exhale after holding a breath for the better part of a year. "It's over," she said. "The legal part, anyway." "The legal part," I agreed. "The rest of it we just keep working on, the way we have been." Mia's fraud flag on the Birch Street deed had been fully cleared months earlier. The house entirely, unambiguously hers again. No lingering paperwork ghosts. She'd since repainted the front door a deep forest green. Something she told me felt like reclaiming the house as fully her own after everything that had almost happened to it. Caleb graduated that spring, and Renata sat in the audience beside me, cheering as loud as anyone. And afterward, Caleb hugged her first before he hugged me, a small gesture that told me more about where things stood than any conversation could have. Grant Pruitt remained behind bars, 11 years into a sentence that would keep him from profiling another vulnerable spouse for a long time. Carla Dunbar's cooperation earned her a reduced sentence, still substantial, still real consequences for real harm caused. Renata and I started something we called, only half-jokingly, Tuesday Transparency Nights. One evening a week where we sat down together and went through finances, calendars, anything either of us was carrying that felt heavy enough to hide. It sounds small, almost silly, written down like that. But it rebuilt something between us brick by brick that Grant Pruitt and Carla Dunbar's scheme had nearly demolished entirely. We talked about the shop's finances honestly for the first time in years. Turned out the credit line issue Renata had panicked over wasn't nearly as dire as she believed, something a single honest conversation with my accountant could have resolved in an afternoon if she'd only trusted me enough to have it 18 months earlier. That realization sat heavy with both of us. So much of this, the fraud, the forged signature, the $61,000, the year of fear and silence, had been built on a problem that honest communication could have solved in one sitting. Tessa became a permanent fixture in our lives, no longer a secret buried in monthly transfers, but a real sister-in-law who came to Thanksgiving, who Mia texted regularly now, who Caleb had started calling Aunt Tessa, without anyone prompting him to. Her son, my step-nephew by whatever loose definition applied now, started coming to Caleb's old rec league baseball field on Saturdays, and I found myself teaching a 6-year-old how to hold a bat the same way I taught Caleb 20 years earlier in a completely different chapter of this family story. Around the 1-year anniversary of that first terrible phone call, Mia asked Renata and me to come over to Birch Street for dinner. The first time Renata had set foot in that house since everything happened. I watched Renata pause on the front porch, forest green door gleaming in the evening light, visibly steadying herself before knocking on her own daughter's door like a guest instead of family. Mia opened it, and for a long moment the two of them just stood there. Then Mia said, quietly, "Come in, Mom." And something about the ordinariness of those 3 words, after everything, nearly undid me standing behind them on the porch steps. Dinner was simple. Pasta, garlic bread, a bottle of wine Mia had picked specifically because it was the same brand from her wedding 3 years after the fact, a wedding Renata had helped plan with genuine joy before any of this darkness had entered our lives. Over dinner, Mia told a story about a customer at her interior design firm who tried to pull a similarly deceptive move with a contractor, and how she'd immediately recognized the manipulation tactics from watching her own family's case unfold. "I actually helped him avoid getting scammed," Mia said, "because I finally understood what those red flags look like in real time." Renata reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry that's a skill you had to learn this way." "Me too," Mia said, "but I'm glad I have it now. And I'm glad you're here, Mom. That's real, by the way, not something I'm saying to be polite. I want to tell you about a smaller moment that mattered more to me than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. About 14 months after that first phone call, Renata came to me on a random Wednesday evening with an actual problem, a genuine, current, unresolved issue, not a confession about the past. One of her old college friends had asked to borrow a significant amount of money, and Renata didn't know what to do about it. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, plainly, "I don't know how to handle this, and I don't want to figure it out alone. Can we talk through it together?" It sounds like nothing. It was everything. This was the version of Renata I'd spent a year hoping to see again. Someone bringing me a real, present tense difficulty instead of hiding it until it calcified into something catastrophic. We talked it through for an hour, weighed the options, and she ultimately decided, with my full support, to offer her friend a smaller amount alongside genuine advice about a debt counselor, rather than either refusing outright or overextending herself the way old habits might have pushed her toward. It was such an ordinary evening, but watching her choose transparency over secrecy in real time, over something that genuinely mattered to her, told me more about how far she'd come than any court document or therapy session summary ever could. Some repairs happen in dramatic confrontations. This one happened over decaf coffee on a Wednesday, and it meant just as much. Grant Pruitt's case became something of a cautionary tale within local real estate and legal circles, and Priya was asked to speak at a regional fraud prevention seminar about the specific vulnerabilities his scheme had exploited: the HR file access, the deliberate address swap, the way he'd profiled Renata's financial anxiety months before ever approaching her. She asked if Renata would be willing to speak briefly anonymously, about what it felt like from inside the manipulation. Renata said yes almost immediately. Standing at a podium months later, in front of a room of real estate professionals and financial counselors, she described the slow, deliberate grooming process Grant had used. The friendly coffee meetings, the gradual introduction of just between us language, the way he'd made secrecy feel protective instead of dangerous. By the time I was doing something I knew was wrong, she told the room, I had already convinced myself the alternative, admitting to my husband that I felt like a financial failure, was somehow worse than fraud. I need you to understand how that kind of thinking takes root, because I promise you, it doesn't happen to careless people. It happens to scared people, and scared people are easier to find than you'd think. I sat in the back of that room and watched my wife turn the worst year of our marriage into something that might actually protect someone else from walking the same path. It didn't erase what happened, but it gave the damage a purpose beyond just the pain it had caused. Looking back now, almost 2 years removed from that 6:14 a.m. phone call, I think about the version of myself standing barefoot on cold kitchen tile, hearing a stranger ask if my wife had authorization to sell a house I didn't even know she was trying to sell. I couldn't have imagined that morning everything that phone call would eventually unravel and, strangely, everything it would eventually help rebuild. I think about Grant Pruitt sitting in a cell somewhere, having spent months building a trap specifically designed to fail in a way that would look like Renata's fault alone, and how the address he swapped, meant to guarantee her downfall, actually became the exact mistake that saved everything he was trying to steal. He wanted a scared woman making a quiet mistake nobody would ever fully investigate. Instead, he got a full accounting of every secret in our marriage, forced into daylight all at once. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, our family survived the excavation. I think about Mia's green front door, Caleb calling Tessa's son his cousin without hesitation, Tuesday transparency nights that have become such an ordinary part of our routine. I sometimes forget they started as damage control instead of just how Renata and I choose to live now. I think about how close we came to losing everything: the house, the marriage, the family itself, over a series of secrets that could have been solved at almost any point with one honest conversation instead of folder hidden behind paint cans in the garage. If you're watching this and you recognize any piece of yourself in Renata, the instinct to hide a problem instead of sharing its weight, the belief that admitting struggle is somehow more shameful than the desperate choices struggle can eventually lead you toward, I hope our story reaches you before a stranger like Grant Pruitt ever gets the chance to. He didn't create Renata's fear of looking weak in front of me. He just found it, weaponized it, and nearly destroyed our family using a vulnerability that honest conversation, years earlier, could have closed off entirely. And if you recognize yourself in me instead, the spouse who never pushed past "I'm fine," who mistook independence for genuine wellness, who didn't notice the walls going up until they'd already closed around something dangerous, I hope you'll ask the people you love a second question next time, and a third, until the real answer finally surfaces. Renata and I are still married, still healing, some days more than others, still doing the deliberate, unglamorous work of choosing honesty over the easier comfort of secrecy, week after week. We didn't get here because the damage wasn't real. We got here because we finally, both of us, stopped letting shame make our decisions for us. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments which part hit hardest. I read every single one, and I promise you, some of you are living through your own version of that 6:14 a.m. phone call right now, even if yours hasn't rung quite yet. I think back sometimes to that morning in the kitchen, coffee pot gurgling behind me, the moment my entire understanding of my marriage cracked open in a single phone call. I couldn't have known then that the wrong address on a stack of fraudulent paperwork would end up being the thing that saved my daughter's house, exposed a scheme that had already hurt other families, and forced my wife and me toward a version of honesty we'd never quite managed to reach in 22 years of loving each other imperfectly. Renata sold the wrong house. She lost everything she thought she was gaining: the money, the secrecy, the version of herself who believed she could carry every burden alone without ever asking for help. But somewhere in that loss, she found her way back to something she'd nearly given up completely: a family willing to sit with her in the wreckage instead of walking away from it. That's not a story about fraud anymore. Not really. It's a story about what happens after the worst mistake of your life, when the people around you choose, slowly and imperfectly, to help you become someone better than the person who made it. If you're still here with me after all 50 parts of this, thank you for staying. Genuinely, stories like ours only matter if someone's listening on the other end. Subscribe if you want to walk through more of these families with me. Share this with someone who needs to hear that broken trust isn't always the end of the story. And tell me below, could you have forgiven her?